Welcome to The Latest Version. I'm your host, Betsy Bush. We're living longer, not just growing older, and we're pushing back against the expectations that we're finished at 50 or 60 or beyond. What do you still want to do? Is it follow artistic passions, start a business, or pivot to something completely unexpected? I'm talking to people who are sharing their insights and advice for others on the path to reinvention. So, what's your latest version? Can there be anything more life-changing than being reunited with your birth family? For the millions of people who were adopted as infants and have longed to know more about their birth parents and their heritage, the field of DNA testing offers great promise, and many people are finally getting the answers they've longed for all their lives. My guest today is Geraldine Berger. Gerri is a professional genetic genealogist who specializes in helping adult adoptees identify and locate their birth parents and other family members using DNA evidence. An adoptee herself, Gerri has cracked hundreds of cases, including her own, and her successes have appeared in news outlets worldwide. She is the author of the book Living in the Know, The Adoptee's Quick Start Guide to Finding Family with DNA Testing. Gerri, welcome to The Latest Version. It's so great to have you today. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Betsy. Thanks for having me.
You know, before we start, I just want to say to all those adoptive parents who have opened up their hearts and their homes to children who needed families, we honor your work and all that you've done to create a family. And this is not about, Gerri, I'm not adopted, but you are. Tell me what it was like growing up in a wonderful family that adopted you. And I want to make sure we're not casting shade on the adoptive families and all the work, all that they've done to try to do the right thing.
Sure. I was fortunate in having a loving family that really wanted to have a child. And my parents were married about 9 years at the time I was adopted and had experienced a series of miscarriages. You bring up a really great point that I underscore in my book and frequently in conversations with adoptees, birth parents, adoptive parents. And that is that no one can love you out of your need to know who you are and where you come from. Of course, you have an identity as, as an adoptee. You're given a name, you're a part of a family, you grow up in a neighborhood or neighborhoods, you have friends and teachers and later business associates, colleagues. And so you have an identity, but it's sort of like you missed the first 10 minutes of the movie of your life. You really don't know how you got here, who you look like. And those questions burn in the minds of many adoptees and other folks with other cases of unknown parentage. And, I talk about this a bit in my book as well, but no one can really love you out of your need to know. And so the fact that adoptees want to search, want to have the opportunity to meet birth family members, has nothing to do with the love they received or the love that they feel and the connection they'll always have to their adoptive families. Growing up adopted was interesting. And really, in many ways, it wasn't much different than, in my opinion, of what my friends experienced, because I spent a lot of times in their homes and your friends' moms and other folks become an integral part of your life, and you see what other people's home lives are like. So in many ways, it was the same. Of course, the difference was I realized at a very young age that I didn't look like anybody. I didn't look like either of my parents. I didn't look like my brother, who was born naturally to my parents 15 months after they brought me home. And I always wondered where I came from. My earliest memory of being told I was adopted was at about 3-4 years old. I don't know if I had entered preschool yet, but we had a family tradition of watching cartoons on Saturday morning and hopping in bed with my parents, my brother and me, and I. And during a commercial, my mother told me her version of the Chosen Baby story. There was a book written in the 1950s called The Chosen Baby, and my mother told me her abbreviated version of the story, which was essentially that she and my father loved each other very much and wanted to start a family, and took a trip to the hospital nursery, and there I was, and they brought me home and called me Geraldine. So there was never a tale about a stork, certainly no mention of another family. And I was certain at the time she told me the story that she was telling me the truth, and it explained a lot in my mind with regard to why I didn't look like them. I think children understand a lot more than people think they do at a very young age. But that's my earliest memory of being told I was adopted. And then when I was in elementary school, I attended a book fair and was sent there with a couple of bucks. So, in the 70s, you were kind of a millionaire if you were a kid with $2 in your pocket.
Sure.
And was perusing the books on the table and noticed one called Are You My Mother by P.D. Eastman.
That was one of the I Can Read books, right? With a cat in the hat on the binder. I remember that very clearly.
And on the cover, there was a picture of a little chick who hatched in his nest while his mother went out to go find food. And he hops all around the town asking a hen and a dog and a bulldozer if they're his mother. And I loved that book because I could really relate to that little chick. And I think ever since then, I started looking for the face of my natural mother in the faces of strange women who might have been about the right age and who maybe had the same color hair. So in many ways, my curiosity began to evolve, and on an informal level anyway, that's where my search for my roots began.
There's I relate to your story very well because I had friends, I think we're about the same age. I had a lot of friends who knew they were adopted from an early age, and probably a lot who had no idea. But there was a particular period of time when there were a lot of kids who were placed for adoption, perhaps because there was such a stigma against unwed motherhood, and with unwed mothers, being shamed into, or given no choice of giving their children. But it seems to be a particular period of time. You call it in your book, you call it the baby scoop era. Can you talk about that a bit?
Sure. I didn't coin the phrase, but the baby scoop era connotes a period of time between 1942 and the early 1970s, possibly the mid 1970s, when there was a surge in births of children who were not born within the construct of marriage, born to unwed mothers. This began during World War II, when young women were pinned and going steady with a fellow who was joining the service and fearing that he might not return. Many of them, of course, consummated that relationship and commitment, which resulted 9 months later in children. Some of those fellows never came home. Some of them opted to break the relationship with the mother. But then, you have a young woman who's living at home with her parents, unable, with no means of support for herself and her child. And as you mentioned, there was a huge social stigma attached to that. Oh my goodness, people would see that she's pregnant. She didn't wait until marriage. This is really going to reflect poorly on the family. She'll be damaged goods. This is what birth mothers were told, and were told for decades.
Yes.
And then, fast forward to the 50s and Elvis and the 60s and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Woodstock and a culture of free love and all of that. And so while adoptions in the United States statistically were, 40 to 50,000 births per year, between 1960 and the early 1970s, there was a real surge to about 150,000 adoptions per year.
Wow.
Probably most likely driven by a culture of people feeling more free.
Mm-hmm.
And but unfortunately, birth mothers were still treated the same way by their families. They were either ushered off to unwed mothers' homes or sent to stay with a grandparent or other family member until her delivery. And then she was told upon returning home, if she had left home, that she's never to breathe a word of it to anyone. That the whole model for adoption in the United States was to pretend as if the birth mother never gave birth, as if the adopting family conceived and gave birth to this child on their own. Even the amended birth certificate that an adoptee receives after an adoption is finalized is in many ways a falsified document, because a birth certificate by definition is someone certifying the truth of the live birth event. This baby was born to these parents and it weighed X and it was born on this day and these are the parents and the address. And so it's really a form of legalized identity theft. And to this day, only 10 states in the United States allow adult adoptees unrestricted access to their own original birth information. Whereas 191 of the 193 United Nations allow adoptees access to their own original birth information when they come of age of legal majority, whatever that is in a given country. The only two countries that never ratified this agreement, the United Nations, it's the UNCRC, the Rights of a Child. And the only two countries that never ratified the UNCRC are the United States and Somalia.
Oh.
Because in the United States, adoption is $1 billion industry.
So your own story is really interesting, because you as a child, again, you knew you didn't look like anyone else. You knew you were adopted. And you, when did you start looking for your birth parents in earnest, or was there a time when you said, I'm going to do this, or I'm really going to start looking, or what? Tell me your process of discovery.
Well, I was certainly always curious. And sometimes that would come more so to the forefront than others. But for the most part, I was living my life as Geraldine Berger with my family and my friends. And then I'd either see a movie or come across a book or meet someone else who was adopted. And those inner pangs of longing to know would surface again. And during those times, I would often ask my mom, my adoptive mother, what she could tell me about my birth mother, anything that she knew, whether or not she thought I looked like her. So I would say probably around junior high school. I was 12 or 13 years old and had a neighbor who lived across the street who was one of my best friends, named Nancy. And we were playing tennis in my driveway and banging tennis balls back and forth. And she was in my Hebrew school class also. and said, you don't look Jewish. And I got that a lot, but I was like, well, what does Jewish look like? But I agreed with her. And I guess because my parents had always told me that my birth mother was also Jewish, and from Northern Westchester, that her family story would have been similar to mine in terms of her grandparents coming to Ellis Island at the turn of the century, etc. And that made me wonder, well, maybe my father wasn't, maybe my natural father was something else. And so people would often say, what are you? Are you Scots-Irish? Are you Spanish? Are you Italian? Are you, and I don't know. And, but I think my search really began in earnest on my 18th birthday. My mom always told me that she would, that she had a copy of my adoption papers containing my birth mother and grandmother's name, and that when I was 18, I could have a copy of them. So on my 18th birthday, I nervously asked her to, if we could go to the safe deposit box and if she would provide me with a copy of those. And a few days later, we did that. And my mom and I didn't make a lot of eye contact then. We were in the little room at the Chase Manhattan Bank in Ardsley, New York. And I was cognizant of how she may be feeling. But I had wondered my whole life about this nameless, faceless individual. And when I looked at the papers, there was her name. And knowing that she had also been a high school student from Northern Westchester, or at least allegedly, based on what the attorney had told my adopting parents, I thought to myself, well, how hard can this be? I have a name, I have a location. How many high schools could there be in Northern Westchester? I'm going to go find her picture in the yearbook. But I later learned that she had used an alias, and what I thought would be a relatively simple search was actually virtually impossible and lasted almost 24 years.
Wow. While you were conducting this search in a personal way, you went to college? What was your chosen profession? What sort of field of career did you choose?
In college, I majored in business and telecommunications. I started out as a telecom major. I wanted to, I was active in the college radio station and took a lot of film classes and learned how to use a camera and editing equipment and all this kind of stuff. And then eventually, having friends with parents who worked for ABC in New York, realized that this might be a very tough field to break into. And despite my love of entertainment and that whole field, decided to have a double major in business. So when I graduated, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. My parents suggested that I get involved in sales because I love people and I'm extroverted. And I wasn't really feeling that, but I had signed up with a recruiting agency who actually recruited me into becoming a recruiter for them. And so that gave birth to later to a career in human resources, where I spent 25 years, went on to obtain a master's in psychology with a focus in organizational development, and became a human resources executive who worked for, I worked for Fortune 500s. I worked for a top 10 American law firm. I worked for startups, which I really enjoyed. And so I had a career in HR, ultimately.
And then when did you, was it the evolution of DNA testing that broke open the case of your own birth family? Tell me what happened there.
Well, in 2007, I was reunited with my birth mother through a registry called Alma that was founded in the 1950s by a black market baby named Florence Fisher. Mm-hmm. And I registered with them in 1991, and no match was made. And eventually I had divorced and relocated and remarried and had moved to Georgia. And I never believed, after several years of having been registered with them, that that was the way I was going to find her. And it was the opinion of several of my mentors in the adoption community that she probably did use an alias, which was not uncommon back then. So I was living in Georgia and emptying a filing cabinet in my home office, getting ready to paint the room, to drag the cabinet out of there. And I had to empty all the files out of the drawers in order to be able to do that. And I came across my registration form with Alma, and I said to myself, maybe it's something, maybe it's nothing. Let me get in touch and see, and just update my address information. And that's when their membership coordinator said, "Gerri, are you sitting down? We have a match."
Wow.
And it was just surreal. I never believed that it would happen like that, or that it would ever be that simple. And we had a wonderful reunion at her home in New Hampshire. Coincidentally, she lived 8 miles from New England College, where I attended school.
No kidding.
She was living in Ware, New Hampshire. A job had brought her husband and herself there 8 years after my graduation. And I asked her when we met for the first time in person who my natural father was. And 10 years would pass. She was unable, because of the trauma at the time and other reasons, to help me locate him and identify him. So, and he had a relatively common name. So probably, I think it was 2013, I had been working with a cousin of hers who lives in Ohio, Jack, who is our family genealogist. And he was doing a Y-DNA test because his father's side was Welsh, etc. Not the side we were related on. But I told him the story, and I told him that I was still interested in learning the other half of who I am and where I come from. And he said, "Why don't you do an autosomal DNA test?" And I said, "What's that?"
What is that?
I did. I tested with Ancestry. And when you do a DNA, when you take an autosomal DNA test through Ancestry or 23andMe or other testing companies, you not only receive a breakdown of your ethnic mix called an admixture chart, you also are paired with your genetic relatives who are either called DNA matches or DNA relatives, depending upon the testing company. And sometimes they're communicative, and sometimes there are family trees posted, and there's an opportunity to discover the truth of who you are through them or through professional genetic genealogists. And it would take another 3 years before I would have a close enough DNA match to actually solve my own case, because the Italians, my natural father was half Italian, and the Italians, in addition to other groups, are very underrepresented in the DNA pools. At that time, I had been volunteering for many years in the adoption search community, and the membership coordinator from Alma had contacted me and said, we were in touch frequently, and she said to me, there's a woman who registered and her birth mother didn't sign up, but she's done a DNA test. Do you think you can help? And I said, I don't know, I'll try. And so I started doing this on a volunteer basis, and was actually able to solve about 40 or 50 cases before I was able to solve my own, because my DNA matches were 4th to 6th cousins, which places your common ancestors back in the days of the Revolutionary War. The tree would just be, it would be a book. It would really just be untenable.
Gerri, let me just stop you for a second, because we've talked about a couple things. I just want to clarify some terms for my listener. Now, Alma is a registry, if I understand it, where mothers who are hoping to locate the children that they gave up for adoption, and the children who are looking for those parents can meet through a registry, and they're paired up that way. Is that how that works?
That's right. They are what's called a mutual consent registry, and there are several out there. Each state in which an adoptee was born or adopted has a mutual consent registry where both birth parents and adult adoptees can register with one another for free to be paired up with one another and release contact information. There's also the ISRR.org. They are the International Soundex Reunion Registry, who also started in the 70s and is free, and where matches can be made between adult adoptees and their birth families. Alma is a nonprofit organization, the one through which I was fortunate enough to be reunited with my birth mother. And today there are probably a dozen free electronic registries online. But unfortunately, the downside is that it has over-fragmented the adoption community who is in search, and no one really knows which registry their missing person will be found in, if anywhere.
So when you found your birth mother, you came up with some very interesting information. And so your heritage was very different from the one that you thought you had when you were growing up as a kid in Quaker Ridge, right?
Yes, that's true. In fact, my half-sister, Rohana, my birth mother on our first phone call told me that I had 6 half-siblings who have known about me since they were old enough to talk, which is very unusual. She had met and married her husband 6 months after I was surrendered for adoption. They went on to have 6 children before she was 30. And each of them, when they were old enough to understand, knew that there was a sister out there who may one day return. And on our first phone call, she let me know that they were all anxious to speak. She told me that, and that they were all anxious to speak with me. And I received 6 emails, long emails from each of them. And the email from my sister Rohana really shifted my paradigm in terms of who I believed I was and where I came from, because she told me that we were Mayflower descendants on our mother's side. And I said to myself, wow, I never would have imagined that I have roots as a pilgrim. Like, none of that really resonates with me. And I had also had that conversation later with my birth mother, and she said, don't be fooled. They were very rusty people, my dear. They were warned by their minister never to go to the New World, that they would certainly suffer from either death at the hands of the Indians or starvation. But they believed in divine providence, and they went anyway. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, that sounds a bit like me, a little bit of a rebel, certainly in those earlier years. So it was interesting to discover that. And also 10 years later, my natural father's side, but it a lot of people, not just adoptees, will take a DNA test believing that they have roots in particular countries or cultures, and find out that there's a lot more to that picture than they ever imagined. And in many ways, for some people, not a lot, but certainly a small percentage of people are discovering that the siblings that they grew up with are in fact half siblings, not full siblings, that a lot of family secrets are exposed through DNA, and people will have DNA matches they don't recognize. Like, you could take a DNA test, we could find out we're second cousins, and you look at those results and say, who the heck is Gerri Berger? I know who all my second cousins are. Yeah. Until you receive an email and discover that I'm an adoptee. So DNA test. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No. It's you're right. There are no secrets now in this age of DNA testing. You can't hide we're learning a lot about children born from sperm donors, that there are a lot more out there, that maybe the donor they thought they were getting was actually the doctor who ran the clinic That's there are several documented cases about that. Danny
I've seen-
Shapiro, a well-known author, has written about her discovery. In her Jewish family, she had blonde hair. She didn't look like anyone, and no one could understand because she thought her parents had IVF help, and it turned out that the patrician, the WASP patrician director of her clinic was actually the donor. It kind of, it's one of these things where you think there was an age when maybe did people think infants were blank slates and you just handed a baby to a family and maybe aside from hair color and eye color, everything else would be taken care of in the nurture part of that baby's formation, and the nature part was very limited. But I think now we're learning that there's a lot to DNA and heritage than we had thought before, right? Like talents and preferences and things like that.
Well, sure. It's interesting. I'd always heard the expression growing up, as many of us have, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Mm-hmm.
But as an adoptee, you can only really conceptually understand what that means without a personal frame of reference and personal experience. People often ask me, since I found my birth mother, who are you more like? Are you more like her, or are you more like your adoptive mom, your mom? And I often say, my experience has been, it's like asking me what my favorite color is. It just depends. Are we talking about carpeting or automobiles or flowers or clothing? It really just depends. But what I did realize was that you inherit, having spent a lot of quality time with birth family members, particularly my birth mom, that you inherit entirely more than how you look. In many ways, I was a watered down version of her. I remember a first visit to her home. We were sitting in her hot tub on my second night there, looking up at the stars. And I said, "Oh, look, there's the Big Dipper." And she said, "Yes, and there's Cassiopeia, Pegasus, and Taurus. We should go upstairs and do your chart, dear."
Oh.
And I was like, "Oh my God, I loved astrology when I was a kid and a teenager." And my best friend and I always used to get those little scrolls from the supermarket in those plastic tubes and call the Jean Dixon forecast from our before homeroom in junior high school. And that was just one thing that we had in common. She was musical. She sang. That was the case with me. She was into the performance arts. That was the case with me. She liked blue cheese, and we had the same laugh, even though, as she would say, we didn't do the time together. Mm-hmm. So in, your talents, your interests, sometimes even the way you laugh, are inherited, your temperament, but the lenses through which you view the world. I think that the people who teach you how to speak are the people who teach you how to think, and the lenses through which you view the world. And I remember asking her on my first visit if she recognized me as one of her own. And she said, "Yes, but you have elephant ears." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "Doris and Lenny. I can see them in you as well." Huh. Not physically, but the way I carry myself, the way I speak, the way I think, my ideas, etc. And so you're kind of both,
right? So Doris and Lenny are your adopted parents. So interesting. So she could tell that there were certain things that were innate to you, but also were part of your bringing up.
That had nothing to do with them.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it's weird because, in my own experience, I went in search of her because of this ongoing, it's more than a curiosity. It was a genuine need to know, and who she was, where she was from, what she looked like, what were the circumstances of my birth, what's my ancestry, my heritage, my ethnicities. And your birth mother holds the key. She knows the answers of the truth of your origins. And I was so fortunate to, at the time that I was matched with her through Alma, to that she was alive, that she was willing to meet with me, that I had siblings that she wasn't trying to hide me from, and that she was very open about her experience then, and and very welcoming, and provided all the information and more that I ever could have wanted to know about my heritage.
Gerri, let's talk about how you help people make connections with their birth parents. How does that work? What do you do, and how do you help people?
Well, I'm a professional genetic genealogist, and I use people's DNA test results through companies like Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, MyHeritage, FamilyTreeDNA.com, to identify and locate their birth parents. Typically, I advise people to test with Ancestry DNA first, because they have the largest population of members, of DNA testers. Their database includes over 20 million people. And so the statistical odds of a close match, first, second, third cousin, etc., are much greater than with the other DNA testing companies, by sheer virtue of the size. That said, as an adoptee or someone with unknown parentage, there are many cases like that. And you also brought up the donor conceived. You just never know where your closest match will have tested. Maybe they got a 23andMe kit as a gift, or attended a symposium where they were handing out MyHeritage kits. So people come to me usually through the adoption community, or through referral, or because they hear about me through a webinar or word of mouth, or lectures that I've given at historical societies and libraries, and say, can you help me? And I ask if they've DNA tested. I offer everyone a free consult to review their DNA test results with them, to just log into their account with them and look at those matches, because the family trees of an adoptee or other person's matches are my puzzle pieces in solving the case. And so ultimately what I do is I generate a family tree chart from scratch. I see where those trees intersect. I knit that tree down to the ground. Sometimes I need to, meaning complete it through research, or by direct contact with adoptees' DNA relatives, and then through a process of elimination, narrow to the birth parent. And then I act as intermediary between the adoptee and the birth parent, or any living relatives that the adoptee might wish to have contact with, which provides the birth family with the emotional space to process that their child, after 40, 50, 60, 75 years, is interested in meeting them.
Now you warn against the adopted child getting on the phone and saying, "Hi, I'm here," or "This is me," because there's just too much. You're not quite sure what kind of response you're going to get. Is a message that you tell people. Is that right?
Yeah, well, there's a knee-jerk reaction to protect this deep, dark secret, because, harking back to what we were talking about earlier, birth moms were warned by their parents at a very young age, if you tell anyone, if you tell your husband, if you tell your kids, your life's going to go down the tubes, they'll lose respect for you, you're damaged goods, etc. You're not an example as a parent. And so there's that fear. And so the people, including the birth parent, who were committed to keeping that secret back then, will often be committed to keeping it 40, 50, 60 years later. The danger in, and this is just through, real life experience, the hundreds of people that I've spoken with over the years. When you contact a living birth parent, if it's a birth mom, you don't know if her husband is standing next to her. Especially if she's of retirement age, if she ever told him. birth parents mourn this loss like a death. Many of them are not in search, and because they don't know that there is a way to search. Unless they're active in adoption groups on Facebook or other social media platforms, what they believe is what they were told years ago. Once you relinquish all parental rights legally, there's going to be no possible way for you to find your child. Not only that, you've pretty much sworn to never interfere in the life of that child or the relationship between the child and the adopting family. And they often believe there would be legal ramifications for that. So when someone contacts their birth parent, the knee-jerk reaction could be a denial. And then it's like a 2x4 hitting that person on the back of the head out of the blue, or someone coming back from the dead. I've often made the call as an intermediary and oh no, you must have the wrong person. Yes. I did have a child on that day in that place, but my child's father was so-and-so, and it couldn't be this other person. And so you have the wrong individual. Or sometimes, I don't know what you're talking about or how you got my phone number, but you better never call here again, or I'll call the police, only to be called back several weeks later, or to have the adoptee be contacted directly by the birth parent. So having an intermediary who's experienced and is not parroting scripts from TV shows, which is a real danger. That's meant for drama and suspense and entertainment. But when people parrot the scripts of these shows, example, hi, Betsy, my name is Gerri. Did you have a baby in 1955? We have to talk. I mean, that's enough to guarantee in real life, a permanent hang up and permanently alienating the adoptee from their birth parent. So giving the birth family the emotional space to process that, knowing what to say and not to say to someone who surrendered a child for adoption, and giving them the space to process that, and sharing with them also, what are the intentions of the adoptee? Why did they wait so long to search for me? Well, until now, there really wasn't a way. How did you find me? So what I do as an intermediary is everything within my power to ensure that the contact between the adoptee and their birth parent or other living birth family member is a positive first contact.
I want to make sure we cover a couple of things because we're coming up close to the end of our time. So it is possible it is possible for a birth mother to take steps to find the child they relinquished for adoption decades ago. Is that right? Or what steps would you suggest a birth mother take?
I would suggest that she test with Ancestry DNA. If her adult child is, if the child she surrendered for adoption, who's now an adult, has tested, each of them will show up in the parent-child category of the DNA matches portion of the software program of Ancestry.com. Many volunteers in the adoption community, including including professionals like myself, will suggest testing with Ancestry first, simply because they have the largest user base. So that's a first step. Also, in the footer of my website, there's an area, geneticgenealogycoach.com. There is a newsletter that folks can sign up for to receive information on how to upload their DNA to other sites once they receive their Ancestry or other DNA results, to help them be in as many DNA pools as possible to increase the chances for a match.
Great.
So I would recommend they test with Ancestry first. Go ahead and hit my website for instructions on how to upload your DNA to other sites, and then to ask for help. It's a very steep learning curve, genetic genealogy. There are a lot of volunteers out there willing to help folks, but oftentimes they complete a few steps and then disappear or get stuck. And that's oftentimes when I'm contacted.
Yeah. You have solved some incredible cases of, unknown, baby left in hotel. Tell that story, because that to me, that just blows my mind.
When I was living in the suburbs of Atlanta several years ago, I made the acquaintance of a woman who became a very dear friend of mine, who invited me to join the Cobb County Genealogical Society, her local DAR chapter, etc. And she had a neighbor who she bumped into on an evening walk with her husband, who told her a story about how and he's in his mid-70s now. And his story is in my book, Richard Cole, who is a very dear friend of mine to this day, as is his wife, Nancy. And he told her a story about how he was left as an infant in an Atlanta hotel room at about 2 weeks old. And that this story made the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which is like the New York Times of Atlanta, 3 days running in 1944 after it had happened. She said, well, you have to contact Gerri Berger. And apparently he had done a DNA test several years ago and, was unable to solve his own mystery, as is the case for many. And Richard called me and we made an appointment to meet. And what's unusual is I was able to drive to his house because most of my clients are from all around the country, even Australia, the UK. But I was able to meet Richard in person. And he had laminated newspaper articles from the 40s in his home.
Wow.
And this was a mystery that aided him his entire life, despite having been raised by a wonderful family who adored him. And I was able to identify both of his birth parents. The newspaper article said that his birth mom checked into the Robert Fulton Hotel as Mrs. Richard Parker from Salt Lake City, Utah. And it turned out that both of his birth parents were from Davenport, Iowa. He's the spitting image of his dad and his paternal grandfather. And I was able to reunite him with his half sisters on each side of his family, on his birth mother's side and his birth father's side. Wow. And when sisters from his father's side came to visit Georgia, I was invited to attend a lunch with them. And we had a DNA party at his house to celebrate his knowing the truth. And long story short, we felt that the follow-up of his cold case really belonged in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, who had published these stories 75 years ago.
Yeah.
And so a famous local genealogist named Ken Thomas, who publishes a column for the AJC every Sunday for decades, put us in touch with a reporter named Bo Emerson, who spent a few hours with me on the phone and a few hours with Richard and Nancy at their home. And I'm going to get choked up. Richard's story appeared on the front page of the Sunday Lifestyles section of the AJC. And now he knows the truth of his origins. And as it turned out, his wife Nancy had a family tree mystery way back to a great grandparent that I was also able to solve for them. And, it's unusual that an adoptee would have such an experience having their own story being published in a newspaper in infancy. But it does occasionally occur, such as when people are, baby left in a vestibule of an apartment building, et cetera. Mm-hmm. He's not the only case, but certainly one that was publicized in the AJC.
That is remarkable. And I guess left unanswered is, is the other half, who, do you know why? Do you know why he was left behind? Was that ever answered to anybody's satisfaction?
By piecing together the chronology of her life, she was young. She actually married his natural father, but that fell apart very shortly thereafter. And then she was married to another man who may or may not have known about her pregnancy, who was in the military and could have potentially been stationed in Atlanta. It's still a mystery as to why she chose Atlanta.
Yeah.
And to this day, we don't know Richard's actual birth date or where his birth mother gave birth.
Wow.
He was given an approximate birth date that he has celebrated his entire life. And try as we have, I mean, he could have been born on a military base. He could have been born at an Atlanta hospital. Maybe she had friends there at the time or relatives. There was just there's just no evidence, no rhyme or reason as to how or why was she alone? Would she have been traveling alone with a 2-week-old from Iowa? Or was she living in Iowa at the time? I believe she and her second husband were living in New England. That's where they were married. And we found their announcement of their marriage in a newspaper. But it was a shock to Richard's half-sister on his mother's side to learn that he even existed.
Wow.
Apparently, she and her mom had a very close relationship, and her initial response was, if my mother had a child that she placed for adoption, I would know. And I'm here to tell you that 99% of the time, no, you wouldn't.
You know, it's all such a human story, and so many people's motivations and what's going on in their heads and what their circumstances are at a particular moment. So much of that remains unknown, doesn't it?
It can. You know, I often say the cases, the stories are as different as the people they involve. You could read hundreds of stories about searches and reunions and still not be able to know how your story was going to play out. Mm-hmm. The stories of others help others understand what could potentially face them. You might have a welcoming birth parent or birth family members. Your half-siblings may or may not have ever been told about you. The same could hold true for your birth mother's husband or her or the natural father. Sometimes birth moms married the father. Mm-hmm. There was a very sad story, a case that I worked on where the birth mom surrendered the child for adoption. Both were students in Boston. They moved out to California, had 3 other daughters. I was hired by the adoptee to identify and locate the birth parents, and they were married to each other. Oh. And when we made contact, the birth mother did not want contact. She never told her daughters about my client. And the father was brokenhearted because he really wanted contact. It took almost a year, all of them living on the West Coast, ironically, or coincidentally, to agree to meet in Florida at a timeshare or a hotel. And my client and her partner met her birth parents for several hours in the afternoon. And her partner said, well, when does she get to meet her siblings? And the birth mother responded, she doesn't, and she never will. So, you have your family, we have ours, mm-hmm. and this is as far as we want to go. Wow. I really believe that if the birth father, that if it were up to him, that would be different. But, sometimes people go spiraling into therapy, go into a deep depression. There's a real fear of finding a birth parent because the fear is of rejection by sheer virtue of the fact that they were placed for adoption. Mm-hmm. They feel that it would be like a second rejection. Yeah. But almost no one gave up their child willingly. It's the most unnatural separation in the world. Many of these women many birth parents were prompted to surrender their baby for adoption by their own parents. Right. And were truly given no choice.
So many, you may get answers, but you may also get more questions. And it's the human story in so many ways. Gerri Berger, I want to thank you so much. This has been an extraordinary conversation. And I don't think I've ever had an hour-long podcast before, but this is the first. And as we know, we've talked for 3 hours about so many things. You're a treasure, and I hope people who are looking for birth families will certainly buy your book, Living in the Know, The Adoptee's Quick Start Guide to Finding Family with DNA Testing by Geraldine Berger. And Gerri, give us your website again.
Yes, it's genetic, www.geneticgenealogycoach.com. And a link to my book, which is on Amazon, is on my website as well. And I have a contact form. If anyone has questions or would like to reach out, they can fill out the contact form on my website and I'll give them a call.
That's fantastic. Gerri, thank you so much for an incredible conversation. And I wish you all the best, and certainly everyone who contacts you looking for answers. So all the best to you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Betsy. I appreciate it. And Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. So, dear listener, I would love to know what you thought of this episode. Did you follow any of Gerri's tips? Let me know by emailing me at betsy@thelatestversionpodcast.com. And did you hear? The podcast is moving to every 2 weeks, but you can sign up on our website, thelatestversion.com, for our in-between episodes newsletter, Checking In, because, well, we want to check in with you. You can listen to the episodes on the website and read more about me and my guests. If you're listening to this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe and give us a thumbs up. It really helps the show. I'm Betsy Bush, and this is my latest version.